Now let's build the Linux Hacker Tool Analysis Laboratory. First, we will install Red Hat Linux 7.2. Now keep in mind there are a lot of different options for installing Red Hat Linux, and installing it can be a challenge. I caution you, don't get frustrated. You'll learn a lot about Linux as you try to get it installed. Most of the time, the default option will suit our purposes. We're going to use the simplest install options for Linux. You can feel free to customize these if you're more familiar with Linux and want to tweak your system. However, the default and simple installation will work just fine. Now, most newer systems can boot directly from the CD-ROM drive. If your system supports this option, I recommend that you go into your BIOS settings, usually by holding down the F1 key while you're booting your system, and tell it to boot from the CD-ROM first. Now, these BIOS configurations depend on your particular computer type, but most of the time it's an option key or a function key to get into the BIOS settings. If you cannot boot your system from CD-ROM, you must create a boot floppy disk. The boot floppy disk will be used to bootstrap your system from the floppy itself, and then the floppy will be used to read information from the CD. So first of all, try to configure your system to boot from the CD-ROM. If that doesn't work, you need to create a boot floppy using your Windows machine to copy files from the Linux CD to the floppy disk. So in your Windows machine, insert a blank floppy and disk 1 of the Red Hat Linux CD-ROM. Type the following commands. First of all, you need to go to the D drive. That's your CD-ROM. Then you change directories into the DOS utils directory, and you use a program called RAW-write. It'll ask you to enter the disk image source file name, and you type images\boot.img. It'll ask you to enter a target disk drive. You type A:, that's your floppy drive. What this will do is it will copy a boot image from your CD-ROM to the floppy disk. To install Red Hat Linux, you now need to boot your Linux system from the CD or the floppy disk that you just created. I've already booted this system as well. You'll get a prompt, and you should select Install Linux in Graphical Mode from the menu. Now you need to make your language selection. I'm going to choose English and click Next. You should select your keyboard model and information about the layout of your keyboard and any dead keys associated with your keyboard. The defaults usually work just fine, so I click Next. Now you select your mouse options. Usually the defaults work quite well, so I click Next. It now shows me the Welcome to Red Hat Linux screen, and I'll click Next. At the Installation Types screen, you should select Server and click on the Next key. At this point, it asks you how you want to partition your hard drive. I recommend selecting Have the installer automatically partition for you and click Next. At this point, it asks you if you want to remove all partitions on the system. I will, because I have no sensitive information on the system, nothing is stored, so I will simply click Next. It now gives me a warning saying, you're going to remove all partitions on your drive. All data will be lost. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I am sure. It's now creating various partitions on my hard drive. At the view of the partitions, I'm going to simply select the default and click Next. I now configure it to use Grub, which is a tool that's associated with the boot sequence. I will also install the bootloader on /dev/hda, and all the defaults on this screen are completely acceptable, so I click Next. The next screen, it asks me if I want to use a Grub password. For increased security, I recommend that you use this password. Select one that you'll remember and type it in. The next screen is the network configuration screen. On this screen, you need to deselect Configure using DHCP. It's very important that you deselect this option. Leave the option for Activate on Boot selected. We now need to type in the network information for this system. This is our Linux machine named Fred. We enter in the network address. That is the IP address, which is 10.1.1.10. We enter in a net mask for the system. The net mask will be 255.255.255.0. We now type in the network, and it's actually pre-populated for us. The network address is 10.1.1.0. The broadcast address is 10.1.1.255. For the system's host name, we will use Fred. Fred will be the system's name. The gateway we will leave blank. The primary DNS we'll leave blank. You need to delete the information that it pre-populates in there. Secondary DNS and ternary DNS will also be left blank. After entering in the network configuration, we click on the Next key. The next screen gives us some firewall configuration options. We will set our security level at high, and we will customize our firewall rule set. We will allow Telnet and FTP to this machine. Now, these options are not enabled by default, but we will allow the firewall to let those protocols pass through. We now click on Next. The next screen gives us additional languages that we need support for. Select the languages you find appropriate and click Next. The next screen is our time zone selection. Select the appropriate time zone for where you're located and click Next. Now we are at the screen where we do account configuration. You need to enter in a root password, and you should type it in twice. First you type it in the root password box, and then you confirm that that password has the same value. After you've entered in your root password, you need to add a user account. I recommend that you add a user account with username user1. You can type in a full name for this user, Fred Smith, for example, and then you need to type in a password for that user. Select a password of your choice. After we've entered in our root password and created a user account, we click on Next. Remember both of those passwords, though. If you forget them, you won't be able to get back into your system. The system now tells us that it's reading package information. These are the different options that it can support for the install. We will select the Classic X Windows system. We will select the X Windows system. We will select GNOME, which is a user interface tool. We will select an anonymous FTP server. After selecting those various options, we click Next. The system tells me that it's checking for dependencies in the software to determine exactly what it needs to install. The next screen prompts me to select my video hardware, and usually the default probe value works, so select that and click Next. The system now tells me it's about to install. Clicking on the Next button will copy the software to the machine. At this point, the system starts to format the hard drive and install all of the various packages to create the Linux machine. This component of the installation process will take between 15 minutes and an hour, depending on the speed of your system. I recommend that you take a break and come back to your system in about a half hour. After about a half hour of copying software, the system will prompt you to insert your second Linux disk to continue. Put in your second disk and click OK. After a little while, it will ask you to insert a blank floppy disk to use as an emergency boot disk. Go ahead and insert a blank floppy and click Next. The next screen gives you the ability to configure your monitor. What you should do is go through the list and find the monitor associated with your system. Select that monitor. Then click on Test Setting to make sure you can see the system screen before you move on. If you can't see the screen, click on Back to select another monitor. With a little bit of trial and error, you should be able to find your monitor on the screen. At this point, you need to remove the floppy disk, remove the CD-ROM, and click on Exit. Your system will reboot. You've just created your Linux system. Next, you need to copy the Linux Hacker Tools to your system. Put the Network Security Training Course CD #1 into your drive once it's booted. Bring up a command prompt and change directory into your home directory. You need to copy the tools.tgz file into your home directory. Finally, you'll use the tar program to open up the tools.tgz file. Once you do that, all of your hacker tools are now in place and they're ready to be compiled and installed. In essence, we've just created our complete Linux Hacker Tool Analysis Laboratory. We will use this tool throughout the course to understand how tools run in Linux.